Warami Midiga, hello friends. Bujiri na Junya, Dharug Nurawa. Good to see you on Dharug Country. Welcome to 11 stories from the River Dyarubbin audio walk at Yarramundi. Naya Giara Jasmine. My name's Jasmine. Naya Dharug Burrabarangul Nuragu. I belong to the Burrabarangul clan of the Dharug people. Bayajul Gubunga Gunungang Yura Guragal Yagu Barabugu Dharug Yura. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Yanawiju Manawiwa Muru Warangad. Walk with me in the footsteps of our ancestors. Garadyi Clever Man Dyarubbin. Listen to the story of our Dyarubbin. This river, Dyarubbin, is our ancestor, a living, breathing being sung into existence from creation. The river holds our dreaming, creation stories and songlines connecting us across countries and nations. Dyarubbin carries a shared creation story of Gurungach, the great eel. The river is our home. From Balgonarang Hill Camp, Windsor, and Marang Nura, the camp on the sand, Richmond, to our Jarraba corroboree place, where Dyarubbin and Wianamata South Creek meet. We look to Naranganbai, place of the old women, and Gara Mulamulu, place of falling stars. Remember, Midiga, tread softly on this dreaming. We were strong here. We remain strong here. We will always be strong here.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that this audio walk contains stories of historical violence and Aboriginal people now resting in the dreaming. Listen and enjoy the stories, but please do not reproduce them in any way. Didgeridoo, thank you.
Come, Yanma, Danawi Bujiri Gumara, walk with me in good spirit as we head down the path to the Grose River and listen to the stories of this place, named after my ancestor Yarramundi or Yellomundee, a leader and Garadyi Clever Man, who with his father Gombari were the first Dharug to welcome Governor Phillip to country downriver from here in 1791. We'll pause at the stand of Gamun, casuarinas or she-oaks at the end of the concrete path near the Grose River.
My name's Leanne Watson. I'm a Burrabarangul woman from the Dharug tribe. My connections go back to Yellomundee. Yellomundee's, to me, a part of the river. The river to me means life and it's our creation story. There's an abundance of resources around the river. A lot of those resources from the river were traded all across Dharug and other countries. To me, the river's very significant. It holds our creation. Yellomundee is the confluence of 3 waterways. That's very significant to the Burrabarangul's history. Yellomundee was one of the Dharug leaders at the time of contact. Not the only leader of the Dharug people, but the one that was most documented and the one that I connect to because he's part of my family. So I feel really connected to him and the group out there because that's sort of where all of our post-colonisation tends to go back to.
My name is Erin Wilkins. I am a Burrabarangul woman from my paternal grandfather. Down at Yarramundi, where the 3 rivers meet, was a massive tool-making site and massive, massive workshopping areas where you can find thousands and thousands of grinding grooves, highly significant of the sharpening of axe heads, spearheads, and artefact scatters where they were breaking the rocks down into that weaponry form that they needed. And we actually had neighbouring nations like the Gundagara, the Thurl would come up sometimes, the Dark and Young would come down. They'd do their bartering or their trading of resource while we're there. Yarramundi was a massive ceremonial landscape as well. So you had other nations coming in for ceremony. People from Yarramundi would leave and then they would travel to, say, the southeast Queensland areas for their particular ceremonies. It was a huge, significant area.
Dagga floodplain forest. Once covered Dyarubbin's whole floodplain, but there's very little left. The forest was mostly cleared by colonists for farming. As well as being a weapon and cutting tool, we used axes, often made here at Yarramundi, to climb trees in these forests, striking footholds into the bark to climb sometimes enormous heights, hunting for wali, possums, bats, and wiriga, lizards, and to collect grubs and gudjung, bush honey. The beautiful Grose River, winding for 60 kilometres through the sandstone valley of the World Heritage listed Blue Mountains National Park, was named after Grose, one of the early acting governors. The Dharug name for the Grose River has been lost, but we hope to recover it in time. Up ahead, the Grose River meets Dyarubbin, the Hawkesbury River, and the Nepean River, which flows from Robertson in the Southern Highlands, bringing with it the waters of the Warragamba, Wallandilly, Cox's and Nadai rivers. One mighty river system, now known as the Hawkesbury Nepean, flows for over 470 kilometres through Gundungurra, Wiradjuri, Dharawal, Dharug, Darkinjung and Gurungai countries, from the highlands of Goulburn to the sea at Broken Bay, north of Palm Beach. European explorers came across the Nepean and Hawkesbury at separate times, not realising that they were the one river. Governor Phillip named the lower part of the river the Hawkesbury after British politician Lord Hawkesbury, while Lieutenant Watkin Tench came across the upper river near Penrith. It was initially known as Tench's River, before being named after British politician Evan Nepean. Much older than humans, these rivers have been here for millennia. Geologist and St Albans local Gil Jones tells us the story of the Hawkesbury sandstone we can see in the escarpment of the vast Grose Valley Gorge, through Gulamata, the Blue Mountains, and all around us.
The Hawkesbury sandstone, or Sydney's sandstone, tells us that it was deposited by a river on the scale of the world's largest rivers. A river system that was operating more than 200 million years ago. But we also know that more than 200 million years ago, and at least until 100 million years ago, the Australian continent was part of a great southland, the continent of Gondwana. Australia was joined to Antarctica in a single continent. That opens the possibility that the rivers that fed Sydney's sandstone may have originated as far away as Antarctica itself. Certainly if we project back to the southwest, where we know the sand came from, we end up in Tasmania and then in Antarctica if we're talking about Gondwanaland. The transantarctic mountains at the present time, which poke through the ice in various places in East Antarctica, are the roots of a mountain range that would have been at that time in all likelihood of Himalayan proportions. What is more, there are indications mineralogically that the sand that forms the sand around Sydney has a likely source in Antarctica. So what started out as a grand riverine sand plain more than 200 million years ago became detached from its source in Antarctica. The sand itself turned to stone, sandstone, and the whole lot 100 million years ago along the eastern edge of what is now the continent of Australia was heaved up in the air to create the present landscape around us. That prior sand plain is now a dissected plateau. The river systems created, the drainage systems created first 100 million years ago, have etched the sandstone. One of the wonderful things about this part of the world is it was where Charles Darwin cut his teeth as a young geologist, not a biologist, as a young geologist. And he was the first person to speculate about the origin of the Blue Mountain valleys. He found it very difficult to believe that valleys like the Grose had been excavated by the rivers that flow in them.
The Grose, Warragamba, Wallandilly, Dyarubbin, the Nepean and Hawkesbury, Colo and Gunnedah, the McDonald rivers, have all cut their way through that ancient raised sandstone plateau, continuing to move sand and rocks in their path. Over the other side of the Grose River, you can see Waterkeeper Reserve. Floods in 2020, 2021 and 2022 wiped out much of the native vegetation, which for the last 25 years, local resident Mark Anderson and a small group of bush regeneration volunteers planted on the riverbank to create a park in what used to be a weed-infested four-wheel drive playground.
'93 or '94, the group actually got their hands dirty. It's just such a mess, the whole place. It was really open and there's no gates. And cars were everywhere. Dump cars, burn-out cars, glass, rubbish. Cars could actually cross the river. It was just open slather, like 99% weed and very few natives here at all. All this was willow once. The odd casuarina amongst it, but mainly willow, privets and balloon vines. The Yarramundi side of the river was a mining site. That wasn't even a reserve when we started. The mining had finished. That was Barra. They owned that land. They took river pebble out. They mined river pebble 24 hours a day. These concrete blocks, they were in the river and we got them out. They're stabilising blocks for the railway tracks. It's a huge revegetation project for the riverbanks. So basically we just remove the weeds, we do a section at a time and then replant, weed mulch, casuarinas, gums, lemandras, Melaleucas staphyloides, angophoras, and then to stop the four-wheel drives coming up and down the riverbanks because they were destroying our work. We got grants over the years. That's how we operated. We could hire machinery to help us too because it was too much for us. And we could shape things and make it a park.
The 2020 flood saw a massive inundation in the Grose Valley and nearly a metre of silt was deposited in the Waterkeeper Reserve car park. This was after the Black Summer bushfires of 2019 and early 2020, which burned through the Grose Valley, leaving the ground vulnerable to runoff. Let's start walking down to the confluence of the Grose and Dyarubbin now. Look out on the other side of the Grose for the old Grose River course, which you might still be able to see on the other side, tucked in behind the sand. This confluence has been known to shift dramatically in floods. Yarramundi Reserve used to be an island in the middle of the river which ran around it. Ahead of us, what was a long, wide, sandy beach was swept away in the 2020 flood. Massive fallen gum trees were brought down and came to rest on the sand here. Major flooding in 2022 washed away some of these giant gums and partially buried others, which you might notice as we walk along.
We've had more native regeneration in the last two floods than us fiddling away trying to do assisted regeneration. Yeah, it was good because all the seeds in the silt. The first flood had the most silt. Because all the previous floods before that, you just get a really thin top dressing in here. I just think there was just so much water. The speed of the water just took it. Because previous floods, usually the Nepean comes up first, and this just backs up. What happened on that flood, the Grose Valley got more rain than the Nepean. So it had the speed this time, and just bushfires. That's what I put it down to. Over the years, the river's always changed course with whatever floods, depending on the heights. And that was the original entrance to go swimming, was down there. Over the years, it's changed, and then it was up here, because that was the main part of the river. Yeah, and it's changed course.
When you reach the confluence, we'll stop a while and look out over the river. Looking along the river's edge, and even in the riverbed at Yarramundi, we can see lots of gamun, casuarina, lying down, pushed over and uprooted by the force of the recent floods. Local resident and bush regenerator Fred Wood has been watching this confluence or river junction since 1972.
The floods are part of a cycle, and you can really see why having hardwood trees, for example, are important. Because when they drop down, they're there for a long, long time, almost as long as they've lived sometimes, 100 years. What that does is help build the bank and keep the bank strong. And they also provide habitat in the river itself, under where you can't see it. So that's good.
Yeah.
It just doesn't look good. But it's a cycle. So after that flood, Jeff and I paddled up the Grose River. We were absolutely amazed at what the Grose had done to the riverbank, because it took out really mature, strong trees, eucalypts and casuarinas, high up the bank, and there's just a vertical drop, and then you could see there's a grassy paddock up there. So it was like a 5 metre high cliff of alluvial soil that had been there for a long time, and that was all raw again, you know. So going, geez, because these trees would have been over 100 years old, you know, they're almost a metre thick. So that junction changes every big flood.
Yeah.
So I've been watching it now for a long time. So gravel extraction changed it. That whole area keeps changing. So the river will swing this way and then it'll go back.
Grace Karskens, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of New South Wales and author of People of the River.
The first exploratory trip along the river in 1789, they would have come up from Broken Bay, those massive cliffs, and going further and further up the reaches, and it's very windy. And of course, what they're looking for is farmland. As they come up the river, they start to see river flats, but there's other things that they notice. The banks, the lowlands were all churned up, and they knew it was yams. It was women digging for yams, as we now know. The yams were the staple food of the Dharug people on the river. They look up into the trees, some of which are 50 metres tall, and they see flood debris. This is like the good news and the bad news, because at last arable alluvial river soil, but obviously there have been massive floods through, and there was one we know of in 1788, a really big one. So that would have filled them with awe, I think, and a bit of worry. They made it all the way, winding around to the great falls or rapids at Yarramundi, which is also where the Grose River comes down from the mountains. So it's a 3-river confluence. That's a nick point where all the cobbles, the great huge cobbles, gather, and that's why you get rapids, and that's why the boat couldn't go across those rapids. So it's what they used to call the head of navigation. That's as far as you could get. And they could hear the sound of the water on the rapids from way down near Richmond Hill. At Yarramundi, there are extensive cobble rapids, and cobbles are actually just big pebbles, and those cobbles have been brought down by the Nepean River for tens of thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And the reason they are collected here is because this is where the river becomes braided and separates, and the power of the water slows down. And the more cobbles there are, the more join them. The cobbles building up slow the water down, so it's possible for people and animals to cross the river here. Now that's what makes this part of the river and the area to the south on the Nepean different from the Hawkesbury. The Hawkesbury doesn't have rapids or cobble crossings, but the Nepean does, which is why early settlers called it the Pebbly Way. So it's fascinating that this becomes the area where Aboriginal people can cross from one side of this mighty river to the other. This is where all their tracks and roads go. We think that Springwood Road, which leaves the river from around here, is actually an early Aboriginal track into the Blue Mountains and reaching up to Springwood. And it starts here, where you can get across the river. There were collections of Aboriginal gunyahs here. People were still meeting here in the 1830s for contests and corroborees. So there's this overlay geography of ancient Aboriginal use, with the settlers using the same crossing places to get to the other side and into the Blue Mountains, and also driving, eventually, their cattle up over the mountains and across into the west.
You'll see more of these Durabangiba river rocks as we reach the Nepean. Until the first bridge was built here in 1925, Dharug people and European settlers walked across the river here.
Ashton's Falls, a little below the junction of the Nepean and Grose, across the Hawkesbury proper, was the ford mostly used by residents of South Kurrajong. They availed themselves of this route, not because the road was shorter or superior to that by the Punt at North Richmond, near where the bridge now stands, but in order, chiefly, to avoid the toll. I have known pedestrians walk round by the falls and wade the ford to save the tuppence. I knew one old lady who lived at North Richmond. She owned no horse, but she possessed a serving man whom she took with her to carry her across the ford. After having delivered her safely on the Yarramundi side of the river, it was his duty to remain there until she returned to convey her back again. On the last occasion he fell and deposited her in midstream. She ever after went by the Punt and paid a tuppence. Sam Borton, The Hawkesbury Herald, December 25, 1903.
With continuing development west of the Hawkesbury, a third river crossing is currently in the planning stages, crossing the Grose River just upstream of Yarramundi Reserve. Bessie Clemson was born in Richmond in 1899 and lived at Yarramundi from the 1920s.
You were telling me you remember bullock teams coming down here with logs for the railway?
Teams, yes, I remember those. Every bullock had its name. They just had trouble getting them across the river. One day the parson came across and they're swearing and cursing calling the horses, everything. And he said, now boys, take it cool, take it cool boys, I'll get them across for you. And he a lot of nice sweet talk and he got them up the cutting.
Bessie's husband worked at the Yarramundi sand and gravel mine, right here at Yarramundi Reserve, stretching several kilometres upstream on the Nepean. This site was called the Island at the time, as the river split and ran around it. The western channel of the Nepean was filled in as part of mining operations. The mine opened in the 1920s and operated for about 50 years. An aerial ropeway was used to transport the sand and Durabangiba river stones across the Nepean to a processing depot on the other side. It was then transported by a specially built railway line to meet the Richmond-Kurrajong line, which started construction at the same time mining commenced. The lagoon in amongst the trees on our right is what remains of a quarry site from the sand and gravel mine.
When the gravel company first started, he worked there, and he was with them till he died. And he first worked, I think, on one of the machines. When they first started, they had the Barbara Greens right on the river bank. Then they had the ropeway from here down to North Richmond. You might see down there, I think the depot still got the goldstones down back as the depot. But they've been going for a lot of years and a lot of alterations in it.
The Dyarubbin river rocks mined here at Yarramundi were the same rocks that our people used here for tool making for at least 60,000 years. Floods in 2022 came down heavy in the upper Nepean and brought a huge amount of these gibbers rocks into Yarramundi, which you might see mounded up as we head upstream towards Yarramundi Bridge.
These rounded cobbles are actually very hard stone. It's not like the local sandstone that you find further north. And they include rocks like basalt, rhyolite, chert and silkrete. And all of those are great for making very sharp tools, especially axe heads and other tools for cutting and sharpening. Most tools were made of wood. Originally, this area was surrounded by very tall forests, so plenty of timber around to make tools as well. The other great use for this hard stone, especially silkrete, was as the points for spears and what was often called the death spear. So the area became a tool-making powerhouse for Aboriginal people. We know that axe heads from the Nepean ended up in the coastal areas around Sydney and also up in the Hunter Valley. So this area, this powerhouse of toolmaking, was connected to many other places via trade routes, via the rivers and the creeks, but also overland.
Let's slowly head upstream along the Nepean towards the bridge, where you'll see more Dyarubbin river rocks and Garmun she oaks pushed over in the force of major flooding in 2020, 2021 and 2022. Dr. Ian Wright is a water scientist from Western Sydney University who works extensively on the Hawkesbury Nepean river system.
We've extracted so much sand and gravel out of the river, and that was a really important part of its physical makeup. In high flow events, the eroded sediment is actually a really important part of the stream environment. We've changed it forever. And I remind my students that the gravel that was used as an aggregate to build Warragamba Dam, that came out of the Nepean. Thousands and thousands and thousands of tonnes were removed. We've kept going. We don't take anything like as much out of the river now, but we take it out of the floodplain, and that's the Penrith Lakes. And all of that changes the river. We change the flow, we change the sediment, we've changed land uses, and we've discharged waste into it. And surprise, surprise, the river's as good as it is.
I looked at the Hawkesbury and the lower sections of the Nepean, so Penrith to North Richmond, and in summer last year it was about 30% effluent, the flow in the river. It's treated, generally a bit more than primary, secondary and tertiary. Their level of treatment is getting higher. This river is an absolute environmental treasure of southeastern Australia. It's absolutely loved, but there is no coordinated management whatsoever to look after the values that people love. It's an absolute disaster of management in my mind. So it depends, safe. It depends what your purpose is for the river. If you want to preserve the ecosystem, it's not safe at all. And in terms of bacteria and blue-green algae is one of the big health problems here, not safe at all from time to time. And as when I last looked, there was a bloom at Yarramundi, just in that area where the Grose River comes in. When you get high nutrients and it's warm and lots of sunlight, and sometimes the river can provide just the perfect conditions. So they have had blue-green blooms going down 20 or more kilometres of the river. And in fairness to Sydney Water in particular, they have improved their sewage treatment. So they've reduced the level of nutrient in their effluent, but we've got probably hundreds of thousands of more people. So if you have more flushing toilets, even if you reduce those levels, the volumes are going up, so the river cops it. I don't think we should be discharging our effluent to the river. We're using the river as a giant flushing toilet. This is the Hawkesbury River, All the tributaries of this provide Sydney with about 98% of our drinking water. Warragamba's one, Avon, Cataract, Cordo, Winchicaraby, it goes on and on and on. This river gives so much to us, most people don't even realise. And in return, we give it effluent and runoff. The Hawkesbury and the Nepean is the beach of the West for so many communities. Here at Yarramundi, it's really popular. You can get hundreds of people here on really hot days. I've got my hands on some government data, and the river generally is good for swimming, generally. But there are times when it is absolutely not good, and those results aren't shared with the community. And I think that's dangerous, irresponsible, and risky.
This part of the river is home to Barra, bulrushes, reeds, and submerged plants like ribbonweed. There are over 1,500 species of native plants in the Hawkesbury Nepean catchment. Over 160 species of Magura fish have been recorded in Dyarubbin. Our local natives include Australian bass, smelt, burra, short and long-finned eels, mullet and gudgeon. There are also introduced species such as European carp, goldfish and mosquito fish. Dyarubbin is also home to gudugulung, short and long-necked turtles, and Badung Platypus.
Hello, my name is Alan Izzard. I'm from Bass Sydney Fishing Club. I'm a passionate bass fisherman from the rivers around Sydney. Strictly catch and release from Bass Sydney Fishing Club. We do not kill anything. We use barbless hooks. We squash all the barbs, so they're easy release. Often I put in around Yarramundi itself in the kayak. And the good part about Yarramundi, you can go either way, you go upstream or downstream. Half the fun of the fishing as well is the paddle. You see all sorts of different, it's not just fish, it's all the birds. And the lizards are fantastic. They are so much fun to play with. Oh, they attack your lures. If you use a surface lure, those little things will dive on your lure, so you've got to be careful that they don't hook themselves. They get up in the trees. Sometimes you don't see them because we're always casting close to the bank. That's where the fish tend to live most of the time. A bass, Australian bass. It's all we fish for on this river. And bass live all the way up in the fresh. They'll go right to almost to the very end of the fresh. The bigger females tend to go the furthest. With what we've done to the river over all these years, what the rubbish we put in, they still survive. You know, so they're pretty resilient. They hit a lure as like they hit a prey to kill it or make it so they can't get away. So it's a massive hit. You know, when often you'll hit a stick and it was at a hit, but then when you get the real hit, you know it's a fish. And they fight really well. Yeah. You fish for them in the shade generally, along the banks or in the weed beds. There's a lot of ribbonweed, that's what we usually look for, but there's also some nasty stuff. The salvinia is getting worse, but there's another one that sort of grows from the bottom. Bass are a little bit silver and a little bit yellowy and green, depends on how long they've been in the fresh water. When they come down to breed, they're in the salt. They've got to have a specific salinity for them to breed. If there's a big flood, the salinity moves down. If there's no inflow, the salinity comes up. We'll often see an eel, and they're absolutely magnificent looking. The first one I saw, I thought it was a Murray cod. It came right up to the kayak, and the speckling on it was unbelievable. And when I saw the rest of it, I thought, that's no cod, it's an eel. I'd like to see the river regenerated. People, they buy a block of land and they clear it down because they want to see the water. It just destroys. They don't realise what they're doing, or don't care, I don't know. Our theory is more habitat means more fish. On the land, the better habitat you have, the more insects you get. So it helps everything, you know. The insects fall in the water, attracts the fish. So that's what it's all about. It's all about habitat. If you had no habitat, you'd have no fish. While they take the trees out and they pull out the root balls and everything else, it opens it up to erosion, just washes away. And they start losing land.
Over the Nepean and towards Richmond is Yarramundi Lagoon, one of several long, narrow freshwater lagoons running parallel to the river across the Richmond floodplain that likely trace out older river courses. One of the first recorded sightings of a Badung Platypus by Europeans was in Yarramundi, Warradya, where in 1797 Governor John Hunter observed a Dharug man spear a Badung. Yarramundi is an ancestor to many of the Dharug mob, who, like myself, are descended from his daughter Maria Locke. She was born on the Richmond lowlands, near a similar Warradya. In the Dyarubbin project, we worked with historian Grace Karskens to map a list of Aboriginal place names along the river recorded by Reverend John McGarvey in 1829.
We have a record from the Sydney Gazette of the settler people calling the lagoon, now called Yarramundi Lagoon, Yellowmundee's Lagoon, and you catch really big eels there. Our Dyarubbin project found 3 lagoons which have names very similar to leading Aboriginal men in this time. One is Yarramundi, another one is Kobe, which could be Colby, and another one is Mari, and there's a leader called Mari. Perhaps these were birthing places. Perhaps these are places where these people were born and they're named for their birthplace. Yarramundi now is where the Grose River comes in, and it was named after that lagoon. You know how names just travel across nearby country?
A small party of settlers came up the river in 1794 and started to farm at Dyarubbin, our corroboree place, at the confluence of Wianamata, South Creek and Dyarubbin near Windsor. Dyarubbin's fertile alluvial soil, once home to our Midyin yam beds, produced abundant crops for the settlers, and more settlers came, hundreds, then thousands, moving in and spreading quickly along the river's fertile reaches. Our people lost access to the river and to our food, resources, pathways and ceremonial grounds, and our people fought back in what historian Henry Reynolds describes as Australia's earliest and longest war. It was 1803 when the British government granted land to settlers and ex-convicts here at Yarramundi. Among the first to be granted land here was ex-convict and successful businessman Andrew Thompson, who had extensive property around Windsor and was a constable. In 1804, Thompson received 78 acres between the Nepean River and Yarramundi Lagoon. He named it Agnes Bank, after his mother. He quickly developed the land and purchased adjoining land granted to discharged soldiers.
If you had been at Yarramundi in 1805, you would have seen a very muddy, very wet posse of settler men dragging a boat across the river, the rapids here. They were on a mission to kill Aboriginal people, and after they followed a few false leads, they actually succeeded at shooting into a group of people and killing between 7 and 8, including one of the elders, Garadyi. But this didn't come out of nowhere. The party marched out in anger after the killing of 2 soldiers a long way down the river, past the Colo. John Llewellyn was put to death by spearing and his servant was almost killed. And then Thin Adlam's hut was set on fire and he and his servant were burnt to death. And then the warriors, led by the great resistance warrior Branch Jack, chopped up their limbs and threw them about the place. We don't know why those soldiers were targeted. It's possible that they had committed crimes and were paying the price. It's possible because they were soldiers who had marched out and killed Aboriginal people in massacres, they were paying the price for those events. We just don't know. We don't have a record. But what we do know is that local constable Andrew Thompson did marshal this posse of settlers who set out on that retaliation drive, really, and massacred 7 or 8 people in response. And that's how this war was fought on Dyarubbin. This was the second outbreak of this long, long war on Dyarubbin. Dharug and Darkinjung resistance was met by settler and military retaliations that killed innocent people, which of course then set off more revenge attacks into a spiral of violence. After that massacre, that party under Andrew Thompson marched back to the one settler who lived on the west side of the river. He's an ex-soldier too, Obed Aiken. They knew he wasn't going to be safe on that side of the river because that side was still the Aboriginal side. And so they left some armed men hidden in a room, and they knew that Yarragawi's kinsman, young Charlie, a boy who had been stolen as a child, they knew that he'd be coming to knock, and he did. He was extremely angry and grief-stricken at the death of his kinsman, and when he began shouting, those men burst out of that room and shot him dead on the spot.
This is just one of the records that we have of frontier violence here at Yarramundi, records that were all written down by British settlers. The actual loss of our people through sickness, war, imprisonment and despair is likely much greater than was ever recorded, and the devastation to our families, culture, country and law is still deeply felt in our community today. In 1816, following warriors' attack and killing of settler Maria Lewis here at Yarramundi, 4 Aboriginal men were sentenced to be hung in trees at Yarramundi, Redbank Creek and Comleroy Road by local magistrates William Cox and Archibald Bell. This is thought to have led to the onset of 8 months of hunting and killing Aboriginal people along the river. The massacre of 20 just upstream of here at Shaw's Creek was described by James Tobias Ryan, born just over the river at Castlereagh.
At daybreak next morning, they proceeded towards the blacks' camp, and coming stealthily in, they got close up to it when a little dog gave the alarm, and one of the blacks got up, but was shot down almost immediately. The gins and pickaninnies set up a scream, but many were shot before they could rise, others running here and there trying to escape from their pursuers. About one half, about 20, were slaughtered on that memorable morning by the 3 bloodthirsty wretches.
In 2014, Shaw's Creek, upstream from here and part of Yellomundee Regional Park, was gazetted as an Aboriginal place, in recognition of its significance to our people. Today, it's a space for coming together, teaching and ceremony, and for the Yellomundee Fire Sticks Cultural Burning Project, cleaning up country with cool burns and bush regeneration. Archaeological work at Shaw's Creek in the 1970s and 80s explored rock shelters and engravings, logging over 8,000 worked pieces of stone. Archaeologist Eugene Stockton and his team found a Mugin yam plant growing in one of the rock shelters. On the Nepean, near Shaw's Creek, is Black's Falls, another known Aboriginal tool-making workshop and campground for our people, and home to the largest axe grinding site in the region. In the 1940s, 2 parallel rows of boulders across the water there were identified by anthropologist Fred McCarthy as the remains of a fish trap, confirmed by local Peter Howe, whose father had told him that Aboriginal people caught plenty of fish there in the 19th century. The Howe family arrived on the other side of the river here in the 1820s and built a watermill to mill wheat into flour, diverting water from the river and through the mill wheel. Many farms in the area were growing wheat, and Richmond local Sam Borton recalls,
"The great mill wheel must have been nearly 20 feet in diameter, solely and steadily revolving. Often While waiting for the bag of wheat, which my brother and I had taken to the mill for old Harry the miller to put through, we laid neath the cool spreading shade of the wood that surrounded the mill, and amused ourselves by jumping the stream and swimming in its turbulent waters after it had left the wheel. The mill has gone by the agency of the treacherous waters which swept down at times like a roaring sea. Although it stood the floods of 50 years, it succumbed at last. Often after the floods, had its plucky owner repaired some break and set it going again until I think year 68, when the banks of the river and acres of the farms nearby were swept away. The river deviated some half a mile or more from its original course, and there being nothing for the mill to stand on, it had to go. In 64, the river rose without any warning. We had had no rain here, but the water rose so fast that there was no time to clear the mill. Bags of flour were washed away and lay strewn along the banks. Sam Borton, The Hawkesbury Herald, Friday, December 18, 1903.
J.P. Josephson, in his History of the Floods on the Hawkesbury, says in the 1870 flood, the confluence of the Grose and Nepean rivers shifted eastward by 1/4 of a mile or 400 metres.
We think that geographical features like rivers are stable and that they'll always be the way they are now and were always in the past. But this isn't always true. There was once a long tongue or peninsula of land that separated the Grose and Nepean before they run into each other. That entire tongue of land was washed away when the river changed course radically during that flood. In the 30 or 40 years before, many small farmers had moved into the valley and the remaining trees had been cut down. And so there were no more roots holding those banks together, and it was washed away.
Wheat crops initially thrived at Agnes Banks, but by the 1880s had all but disappeared, with orchards of oranges and peaches. Dairying and market gardens developed along the broad, rich river flats. Dairying became more popular at the beginning of the 20th century, followed by turf farms and horse studs, which are still prevalent today.
I'm Mrs. Emily Ada Dunk. I was born out at Agnes Banks, 1904. In those days, that was all bush. It was beautiful living, all the families around. People shared their lives with each other and that sort of thing. Everybody was born at home in their own house and died in their own house. And you laid your own people out. In the early days, before cemeteries came, they used to bring them up the river and bury them on the banks of the river. All along the river bank, from Upper Castle Road all through, was all farms, right through to Richmond, and followed the river because that was the only water in those days.
The first bridge at Yarramundi was opened in 1925, paid for by a group of 13 local landholders who taxed themselves for 15 years to pay for it. It was a single-lane wooden bridge. The same year, a flood rose 5 metres above its deck. The approach on the Richmond side was washed away, and 2 new spans needed to be added. The gravel company added a tramway and in 1947 replaced the deck. The bridge washed away in the 1961 flood and was replaced with a 2-lane wooden bridge in 1962. The current bridge opened in 2004 and is submerged by minor floods. We're going to head now for the track that goes around the lagoon behind us and head back towards where we started. If you've come close to the bridge, you'll need to head back a little way to find the track, which leads up a ramped earth embankment behind the sandy beach. Jen Dolan is the head of Sustainability Education at Western Sydney University.
I remember growing up here and eating eels out of the river from when I was 5. So from Yarramundi through to all the wetlands and the creeks out at Garadyi Creek, my family would just take us out because they were Ukrainian and mad for eels, and we would just go fishing for eels. Thinking about it, it must have been from Mum's time in the Skyville camp, because she knew all the back places in the Hawkesbury to go fishing for eels. Whenever I say, what do you think of eels? People go, oh, slippery. Fishermen hate them. I love them because they also represent that resilience, and they do that long migration that no other creature does, and an extraordinary invisible migration. And it always makes me think of the migration of literally everybody who's ever come and stayed in Australia, and particularly my migrant background, but also, my father's colonial settler background. And there's these extraordinary parallels to coming and being part of a country that you're not quite here, you're not quite there. Eels go from saltwater to fresh. One local fisherman is adamant that eels have memories. We've got a young student looking at eel otoliths, which is the ear of an eel, which can contain a record of their journeys in and out of fresh and salt water. If you do a microchemical analysis, you can actually find out where the eels travel or not.
You're listening to the river underwater here at Yarramundi. For our people, the great eel, Garadyi, is the creator of this river system. In a story that spans across neighbouring nations, Garadyi tears through Nura country, twisting and turning, creating the landscape with the force of his flood power, shaping Durumbalua, the path of the rainbow. Massive rock engravings of Garadyi can be found along the whole of Dyarubbin, marking his journey and resting places.
All created by one serpent. Tribes unite together as one. Water-consuming rock.
Discussion around the campfire where the rivers meet. Harvesting yams, hunting for kangaroo for a feast. Dreamtime story is told along the river.
Dharug artist Leanne Watson created 2 paintings responding to the river for 11 stories from the river Dyarubbin.
I really wanted to put a woman in the painting because the river's described in our language as parts of our body, and it's a being. I include a lot of waratahs in a lot of my artworks for healing. Burnt leaves too for our meeting places, because that's what's left in the landscape after we've moved away. The nets, the bags, the coolamans, fishing lines. Around these meeting places on here are women. And we have some rock engravings that are from around this area. We've got the eel in the river, which is pretty significant. And then the turtle, which is my family totem. So it's got the swells in the river too for the deep resting places of the Garadyi. It's an echidna and it's part of the fire songline. Then we've got the fish, kangaroo and the snapper. A lot of these places that we visit, we're still trying to read exactly what they're trying to tell us. Even the river, when you're walking along the river and you see those ripples, and there'll be the big eels and things like that. It's a pretty spiritual, magical place. So this painting, I think it really stands out that it's sandstone and sand country. I've tried to show that deeper time in this one, so it's got the meeting places that are really deep in the painting to show that we've been here for thousands of years. This one's also got the Mariong footprints walking along the songline, so along the river, and it's got the digging stick, which is a very important thing for women. I've got the yams just to show that that's our resource that was along the river. The midgeonies, I did them in white because we can't find them anymore, so I've put them on here as like ghosts. So yeah, the Mariong is my mum, that's the emu. Mariong connects us to a lot of things too. It's our connection to the sky, because we see her laying in the sky. She tells us where to go to in country with certain ways that she lays in the night sky at different times of year. So she's a big seasonal trigger for us. So she'd be telling us when we should go to the river to harvest jams and things like that. She's in the Milky Way, laying up there in a river. The fence is my representation of colonisation. The fence had a really big impact on Dharug people. It's being shut out from a lot of these places. I mean, we didn't understand trespassing. We always, in our culture, shared everything. We were shut out from country and especially the river because of the resources.
I came across this grand corroboree, as it was called, which was held in 1835 at the foot of the mountains somewhere. You can imagine these gunyahs and the large trees with the mountains behind rising up. And it was partly for the benefit of white spectators who were specially invited to come. And this is where Yellomundee makes a final appearance that we know of. He paints himself white, like a ghost, like a spirit, and he says, "White people are everywhere and Aboriginal people are miserable." And this is 1835, so 40 years after he and his father welcomed Philip. And think of the things that had happened between that time. Every single promise had been broken, everyone. So he painted himself white as the ghost that is speaking, dancing that back at these white spectators.
This place, which bears Yarramundee's name, has also seen complete upheaval in the last 220 years. Mining has turned this landscape over, and flooding continues to reshape it.
My name's Dr. Michelle Ryan. I'm a lecturer in ecology and environmental science at Western Sydney University, and I am the Hawkesbury River and Waterkeeper. We've been out to look at the platypus in Western Sydney, sampling in the Greater Hawkesbury, Yarramundi, going up to Kurrajong, over to Sackville and Penrith. We think the Hawkesbury River is the backbone of the platypus population in Western Sydney. So we have this big connecting river that platypus are able to travel to different areas if they need to, or if we see population disappear in an area, that area might become repopulated with platypus as they're able to travel up and down the Hawkesbury River. My role as a waterkeeper is really to be a community voice, so to listen to what people want and how they want to connect with the river, to facilitate workshops, communications between community groups, different organisations, local councils, state government, as well as to collect data to be out on the river. We're really lucky to run a few workshop days. So we ran a riparian assessment workshop, training the community in how to assess riparian vegetation. So riparian vegetation is everything on the riverbank, so all the plants, grasses, shrubs, trees. So we looked at Yarramundi Reserve, which is very well loved by the community. It's also had a lot of people doing bush care, regeneration, lots of native planting. It had a huge amount of water go through. Casuarinas have just been knocked over. The ones that weren't knocked over in the 2021 flood were knocked over in the 2022 flood. We've had huge amounts of erosion, huge loss of tall trees. Our shrub layers have died. Riparian zones that are healthy and that really do well in floodings are really complex systems. So they will be covered in grasses, covered in shrubs, and have beautiful tall trees, and those trees really help in flooding with stability of the riverbank. All those shrubs, the grass layer, kind of help absorb water and also slow down the flow. Areas that still have vegetation are recovering better now. We're working with First Nations groups to really get a recognition of the First Nations voice. The Hawkesbury River was a huge part of their culture, of their ceremonies, of how they hunted, how they fished, how they communicated with other groups, how they moved. So it's really important that we acknowledge that and we bring First Nations people into the conversations about what we need to do on the river, learning from them about caring for the river, moving forward together.
Students from Windsor High School and Hawkesbury Independent School participated in workshops here at Yarramundi, responding in poetry, sculpture, music and drawings to the river stories.
We kind of responded to 3 things at once.
Yeah.
So we did the meeting place, how it used to be a meeting place with the fire and the people around it. And then the
river with the travelling from one to
and
another
also
place.
we wanted to make it look like the eagle as well, and how the eel had shaped the land.
We responded to the reliability that the rest of the ecosystem has on the river.
Yep.
So the big rock in the middle can represent a foundation, something that things rely on, something that's stable and strong. So you have the big rock, which represents the river, and then all the things surrounding it, like the trees and the smaller things and aspects of the ecosystem.
Well, what we've made is a river flowing into the dam, Waterkeeper Dam.
How all the villages get their water from the river.
We've created Gurungach. He's got like a little pin up here, his eyes. That's the end of his tail.
We made Yarramundi where we are now. So that is the Grose River, and this is the Hawkesbury River flowing out to sea.
To realise how old it actually is, or to realise how much it's changed over time. It's pretty cool to know the history of it.
Our Wurrungad ancestors are still here. They are still strong. They hold our dreaming and our culture, which lives on, unbroken, in our blood and in our hearts. Yarramundi is here. We feel his presence around Dyarubbin, feel his spirit within Nura country. Didgerigura, thanks for your company. Tread lightly on Nura. Take care of Dyarubbin. For more information, please see the Hawkesbury Regional Museum website, where you can download 10 other audio walks along Dyarubbin. Nabawunya! See you soon.